Hello, I'm Ernie Humphrey, the CEO of FP&A Webinars. I would like to thank everyone for taking the time to join us for our webinar today, Financial Forecasting, the Encryption Code for Success. I would like to thank our webinar partner today, Centage, whose strong committed thought leadership helps make this webinar possible today. In an environment of complex business dynamics, finance leaders often feel more like passengers than drivers in their business. They are caught staring in the rearview mirror and not planning for, or effectively reacting to, what lies on the road ahead. A reliable financial forecast solves this problem by providing a clear view through the financial windshield of your business. Today, renowned author and thought leader Philip Campbell will share a step-by-step process for planning, creating, and presenting a reliable and repeatable financial forecast. A reliable and repeatable financial forecast will help you define where your company is going financially and where you want to go, explore the dangers and opportunities that lie ahead, create a roadmap to get the company there successfully and on time, and monitor the financial pace and progress on your journey to success. Financial forecasting done right can transform the financial future of your company and helps your company leaders make better, faster, and smarter financial decisions. Few words about FP&A webinars. We offer webinars designed to empower FP&A success at companies across all sizes, across all industries. We only do what we do best, webinars. Now for the exciting housekeeping items. The slides are currently available under the handouts area in your GoToWebinar control panel. In addition to a few chapters of the book, A Quick Start Guide to Financial Forecasting, authored by our featured speaker, Philip Campbell. These are great resources, so I encourage you to download them. If you have any questions or issues in downloading them, please send me an email to ernie@360thoughtleadership.com. Those of you interested in FP&A or CTP credit for today's webinar, you'll have to answer all of our polling questions today and remain on for the durations of the webinar. If you have any questions regarding CTP or FP&A credit, please send me an email to ernie@360thoughtleadership.com. We'd love to hear from you, so I encourage you to ask questions at any time in the questions area of your GoToWebinar control panel. We will do our best to get to your questions at the Q&A session at the tail end of the webinar. Fear not, if we do not get to your questions, we will follow up with you after the webinar. I encourage you to take advantage of the opportunity to tap the extensive knowledge of our featured speaker. Finally, we appreciate your consideration in taking a short survey at the end of the webinar today, as we always strive to improve the ROI of the time spent by our attendees attending our webinar. Now it is my distinct pleasure to welcome our featured speaker, Philip Campbell, to the webinar. He is a CPA and the Senior Vice President of Planning at Amcon Distributing Company, a public company on the New York Stock Exchange. He is also the author of a new book, A Quick Start Guide to Financial Forecasting, and the book, Never Run Out of Cash. Philip spent the first 6 years of his career in public accounting and the last 25 years as a financial officer in a number of growing companies with revenues ranging from $5 million to over $1 billion. It is now my distinct pleasure to hand the floor over to our featured speaker today, Philip Campbell. Philip, the floor is yours. Please take it away. We can see your screen, sir.
Hi, thank you, Ernie. I appreciate that. All right, so let's just start with what our agenda is going to be for the next hour or so. So first, I want to define what a reliable financial forecast is. I'm going to be talking a lot about that and using those three words together, a reliable financial forecast. So we're going to define that clearly. Then we're going to talk about the whys of forecasting and the benefits of forecasting. So the why really, anytime you're going to go off and do something that requires some work, which forecasting does, it's important to kind of understand the bigger picture benefits, the whys of it. And then I also like to talk about the benefits, not just for the company and the organization that you're working for, but with me as my career, much of my career as a CFO, what I found is that financial forecasting had a lot of benefits, not just for the company, but for me in my role. So it made my role much more interesting. It enhanced my own personal influence and credibility within the organization. So I want to share what some of those benefits are, so because you don't always look at those when you're thinking about forecasting in the context of your organization. Then we'll talk about the 10 rules for creating a financial forecast you can trust. That's one of the downloads that I have for you, is chapter 3 from the book. So if you like that and that resonates, then you can grab that PDF, because I go into a good bit more detail about each of those 10 rules. Then we'll look at the recipe for financial forecasting. That's also one of the downloads for you so that you'll be able to go into more detail there. But once we've looked at the rules, when we're sitting down, you're sitting in front of the computer about to get started in the forecasting process, or you're going to make some changes maybe to your existing process, there's a recipe. It's the plan, create, present recipe. And it's important that we kind of follow that and think through each one of those steps to make sure that what we create is something of value. Then we're going to talk about what I like to call the 3-2-1 quick start approach to forecasting, because there's a reason why a whole lot of companies and people and even finance leaders within organizations don't necessarily have a reliable financial forecasting process in place, because there's a lot of obstacles along the way. There's a lot of things that trip people up. And so what I'm going to talk about is how we cut through those things and get a forecast process up and running quickly. All right, so let's start with the definition. So reliable, what I mean is that it's an unbiased, reality-based expectation of financial results designed for decision-making, not precision. So precision is the enemy, and unbiased is what we're creating here. Because with the forecast that I'm going to be talking about with you here is kind of the view through the financial windshield of the business. And it's unbiased in that it's not a budget, it's not a target, it's not the goal-setting process, all of which have bias built into them, just naturally of their nature, because they're more about how do we try to accomplish something or set constraints, say on spending money or something like that. What we're talking about is an unbiased view of here's what's about to happen financially. And then it's a full set of forward-looking financial statements that include the 2-minute summary. So full set of financial statements, meaning income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow. And in the same format that the reporting is done at the higher level within the organizations, which means it's basically the GAAP financials that we're using for decision-making purposes. And in the 2-minute summary, I'll show you that here in just a minute. But really, the result of a forecast, we tend to think as finance professionals that what we're creating is, we got columns for each of the months or the quarters or the years into the future. We do the work, or in many cases, we create a model, and then we plop that on someone's desk. Here's the results of the forecast. That's not how we really provide value. What we want to do is take the insights from the forecast. What does it tell us? How does it help us when we're sitting together with the CEO or the board or investors or shareholders and helping them guide and direct the company towards its financial objectives? And it's part of our monthly or quarterly financial rhythm. What I mean by that is that, when I'm in CFO roles and I've got my monthly reporting package, or what I like to call the monthly confidence package, because it's about much more than just reporting. I'm also trying to shed light, create insight on where the company is going. So the forecast is a part of that financial rhythm, because I see the financial rhythm really as here's what happened financially. That's what we're used to seeing and analyzing and presenting to senior management. But the piece that's missing in too many organizations is here's what's about to happen. So we're going to bring that together as part of the financial rhythm. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that rhythm too, because it's really the secret, in my opinion, to how we can provide value and really make a difference as finance professionals. So here's an example of what I mean by the 2-minute summary. So here it is. We've created a forecast. We have a view through the financial windshield of the business, in essence. And what our job then is, we're going to sit with the CEO who's about to go into the board meeting and meet with shareholders. We got 2 minutes to convey for the CEO the insight that we've gleaned from that whole forecasting process. So here's just an example. We say based on our growth plan for the coming year, we'll need to raise $1.1 to $1.3 million in cash by June 30. The primary need for that cash is the new division that's opening in Texas. And the expansion is forecast at $3 to $3.5 million, driven primarily by CapEx, capital expenditures, and first-year operating losses. That's what I mean by a quick 2-minute summary. What's the essence? What's the insight in the forecast? So we got to be real careful that we don't. Now, some people are going to want to see the results, right? What does the forecast period, income statement, balance sheet, cash flow look like for each of the months or the quarters to come? But really what we got to do is resist the urge and actually make someone work to actually get their hands on that. What we want to do is kind of glean the insight, because that's what we're really trying to do, is make a difference at a more strategic level. So one way I like to look at how this is all put together is kind of like the 3 links in the chain, and that chain is what we're using to pull kind of the company forward. So in the middle there, the goals and targets, that's the whole kind of performance management function within the enterprise where we're setting goals. What does financial success look like for the organization? And it's different in some organizations. If there's an organization that's looking to grow from 50 million to 75 million in a year, well, the goals and the targets and the metrics that really matter and that are going to drive results are going to be a little different than an organization that's just plodding along, maybe trying to just grow 2% a year or something like that. They may be focused more, like their targets may be cost reduction kind of targets. But either way, we've got goals where senior management of the company is trying to take, where they're trying to take the company financially speaking. Actual results, that one link of the chain, is what we've kind of historically, at least within an accounting function, we're providing or analyzing, is here's what happened financially, oftentimes compared against the goals or targets, usually in terms of a budget. But then the other link that's missing that we really need to include in the planning process is the forecast results. So it's a little bigger picture. It's not a nitty-gritty rolled up set of actual financial results. It's a bigger picture. Here's where the company's going. Here's the view through the financial windshield of the business. And here's another way I like to kind of look at the difference between targets and forecasting, because a forecast is not a target. So let's just look here where I've got plan target. And so up on this axis is dollars, what we're trying to achieve. And over here is periods. So generally at the beginning of the year, there's a plan, a budget, a target set, and it shows here's what we're trying to do, here's what we're trying to achieve. And for the most part, generally speaking, all throughout the year, results are compared against how are we doing relative to that budget or those targets. What a forecast does, let's just say that we're out in March or so, and we create an unbiased, reality-based view of what's likely to happen. And we say, you know what, the future is not quite so bright. It doesn't look, here's what the forecast tells us we're likely to achieve, because we're looking at the key drivers of financial performance. We're looking at how those are likely, what's going on right now and what's about to happen. In which case, we're getting out here and we've got a situation where things are not good. So what we want to be, what the kind of the insight in the forecast is, hey, we got to do something different here. We've got to be able to sit down with senior leadership to say this is what's likely to happen based on where we're going. So if we want to actually get back on track, we're going to have to do something different. We're going to have to change what's happening in the field or change the strategy or tactics. But we need to do that over here earlier in the year and not wait till later on. Then the other thing that can happen in a forecast, it's not all gloom and doom necessarily in a forecast, depending on how the targets were set. But let's say here in this case, we're out in March, the forecast is looking bright because the drivers were really hitting on all cylinders, especially in a couple of the key drivers of financial results. The future is bright. We're going to blow away the targets. Now, what's interesting here is that what a forecast is intended to do is to inform management to say, hey, there's some things happening here that we need to pay closer attention to. Because what if, let's just say there's an example where in the budget we had some marketing spend. That marketing spend was about kind of getting new customers, making sure that we are retaining existing customers. But that marketing spend is really creating some exciting results, but in a much bigger way than we had planned in the budget or the target. What we want to do at that point, it may be time to scrap the budget, screw the budget, get rid of the budget, because the last thing you want to do is hold marketing expenses that are successful and are generating big results that's driving a bright forecast. We may want to double what we're spending in that particular category. So a forecast is designed either each month, each quarter, around informing management of the view through the financial windshield so that they can see opportunities and seize on them earlier in the year, or see obstacles and avoid them earlier in the year than they might otherwise do. All right, so a couple good, great quotes. This is a fantastic book to put on your reading list, Implementing Beyond Budgeting by Bjarte Bognes. It's a fantastic book, and here's the quote about forecasts. Some would call On Course to Hit a Rock a bad forecast. But assuming it's true, it's a good forecast, even though it contains bad news. So that's an important component of what a forecast is all about. It's one way to look at it is the forecast says, are we on course to hit a rock or hit the target? and that's part of its reason for being unbiased, is that it's not about trying to coax someone in a particular direction. Steve Player and Steve Morris have a fantastic book as well. It needs to be on your reading list, Future Ready, How to Master Business Forecasting. And so Steve makes a point really, really, really well, and very specifically, is that targets and forecasts are not the same. A forecast is what we think will happen, and a target is what we would like to happen. Very good distinction between forecasts and targets. All right, so Ernie, here's our first polling question.
Thank you very much, Philip, for your outstanding content and insights. As you can see, I've gone ahead and launched our first polling question. We appreciate everyone's consideration in answering all of our polling questions. Those of you who might be interested in CTP or FP&A credits need to answer all of our polling questions. We're asking you your reaction to the following statement. My company has a reliable financial forecasting process in place. Strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly agree, or I don't know. I'm going to go ahead and leave the polling question up for another few seconds in order to be mindful of our time. Then we'll go ahead and close the results, and then we'll take a quick peek at those results, and then we'll get Philip's reaction to those results, and then we'll get back to Philip's great content, and he'll start to get into some detail on the why of financial forecasting. So I'm going to go ahead and close the results. I'm going to go ahead and share those results. So Philip, what we're seeing, which is I think some pretty positive news, we see 8% strongly agree there's a good reliable forecasting process in place. 52% agree, so we've got 60% have that positive reaction. We have 32% that disagree, 6% strongly disagree, and 2% I don't know. So we've got 60% think they're in a good place, 40% and more of that disagree. What are your initial thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's fantastic, because I think those that are strongly agree, that means you got a process in place. What I'm going to try to do then is help you simplify that even more, basically. And for those that don't have that process in place, I'm hoping that what you'll see when I go through the 10 rules and the recipe and kind of what I like to sometimes call the secret sauce for simplifying, that you come away with something where you can get a process up and running quickly and kind of in the top down big picture kind of perspective. So I think we're going to have something for both sets of answers there, Ernie.
Fantastic. So why don't you go ahead and take us to the why of financial forecasting. Thank you, sir.
All right, so these are kind of the big picture whys, and that first in that it helps us define where the company is going financially and where we and the leadership team want us to take it. And I don't mean that in the context of like a 3 or 5 year forecast that shows the future is bright. I'm talking about real identifying the key drivers of performance and what those key drivers are relative to what the leadership team and the shareholders or investors in the company are trying to achieve financially. And then because the forecast, even at a big picture level, is about seeing through the financial windshield of business, it's about seeing those dangers and opportunities, but seeing them in advance. So it's kind of like if you're in a car up on the drive or on the freeway doing 70 miles an hour, we know we've got a rearview mirror so that we can look behind and see what's going on. But we know what we really need that in front of us to get to where we're going and get there safely is that we've got to have the view through the financial windshield of the business, which is what that's really all about. In kind of rounding out, I guess you'd say, a more panoramic view of financial performance. So we can always look to see what happened, but we want to see what's right in front of us so we don't run into something that's going to derail our future. And so I kind of consider it part of almost kind of creating the roadmap for the company. That's why I believe the way I like to think about it and implement is a very strategic kind of process. And then it gives us a tool to help monitor the financial pace and progress on the journey so that we have historical financial statements where we can really drill down on what's happening financially. And then we have that next piece to say, here's what's about to happen. And then more specifically, it forces us really, it kind of drags us kicking and screaming, even if we didn't want to do it, to addressing what are the key drivers of financial performance, because you have to have those, as you'll see in a minute, in order to create the forecast. And then it's shining a light on some of the opportunities for increasing profit and cash flow, because ultimately everything that we're trying to do in the organization, and creating financial success is going to come down to what are we doing in particular areas that are driving profitability or addressing issues or drivers that are bringing profitability down, and what are those things that affect cash flow? Because we all know that it's more than just profitability. So while profits are very, very important to what we're trying to generate in financial success, there's a whole lot else going on with respect to cash flow that we've got to monitor and create metrics on so that we can help drive performance. And then it's all about, in the end, helping everyone in the organization, financial or non-financial, make better, smarter financial decisions. And so here's where some of the benefits are. And I like to address these because they're benefits for the company, but they're also benefits for you as a finance leader, finance professional. And that is, we should, better than anybody else in the organization, really answer the big financial questions in the business. So I always try to first think of, what is an investor or a shareholder looking for? Well, one of them is how much cash or how much excess cash is going to be generated that can be distributed to me, or what will profitability likely be over the next, say, 6 to 12 months? Or are we going to need to increase our bank line because we're about to borrow more? Or can we give the bank a heads up because over the next 6 to 12 months we intend to be paying the debt down as part of our goals for driving a larger net worth? So you got to have those answers to the big financial questions. And what I like about those is it forces you to think like an owner. What are the owners, shareholders, leadership team thinking about? Which kind of plays into something that I believe we should all really work for, because I think this helps drive the value that we add in an organization, but it also makes our work a whole lot more fun. And that is, we should put a lot of effort and thought into how do we help make history in the organization and not just record or analyze it, because it's easy for us to get caught up in our traditional role, especially within accounting, of just recording transactions and providing the results of those, or analyzing what's happened in the past and then providing that information in a more kind of compliance-related part of our job. But really, if we're thinking more strategically and we're helping get the company where it's going in a bigger picture, more strategic way, and we're thinking like owners and we're talking like owners and we're asking questions like owners, we actually get to the place where we're actually making history. We're influencing where the company's going. And for me, that just makes all the difference in the world. And I think it's the key to adding value. The more value we create, the more money we make. So for me, it's just kind of a virtuous cycle. And then it forces you to develop a deeper understanding of the business model. It helps you influence your own, or enhance your own influence and credibility within the organization. Because I've been in organizations where even that management wasn't, and the leadership team wasn't asking for a forecast. I was doing it for myself because it helped me understand what was going on. And then people would begin asking me questions because I had a very good view of what was about to happen. And then so after a while, people would get to say, Philip, what is it that you have that you have all the answers to these questions? So then it just kind of naturally then becomes a part of what we provide to the board and others. I learned that very early in my career. So the last thing, and this is maybe somewhat counterintuitive, is that it creates, when you have a reliable financial forecasting process in place, it really creates permission to provide bad news. So think about that. And I'm going to talk about this at the very end. One of the fears that we all have that we don't really talk that much about when it comes to forecasting. But it creates, what nobody likes to go to the CEO or the board with bad news. But when you have a reliable financial forecasting process in place, and the leadership team wants to have an unbiased, reality-based view of what's likely to happen, when the news is bad, it's bad, and everyone doesn't focus on shooting the messenger. They focus on, let's get together. Let's take a look at some of these assumptions. Let's see if we agree. Let's see if we can rely on this, because now we're going to sit down and make decisions that are going to help drive the company where we really want it to go. Okay, so just like everything else, maybe in life or a business, there's a process, there's some rules about how to go about doing something. And what I call the 10 rules for creating a forecast you can trust, many of which are counterintuitive. So I want to just pay close attention that many of these are counterintuitive. And then before we look at them, I have what I like to call the secret sauce of sorts, or what I otherwise refer to as the 3-2-1 quick start approach. But Before we talk about the rule, I just wanted to have you just put this in the back of your mind and think about this as we go through the rules in a little more detail. And that is, when you start a forecasting process, or if you already have one in place, there should, this is especially true when you're starting one, there should be 3 very specific questions about the numbers that you yourself want to have the answer to. Maybe it's, how much money do we think we're going to borrow on the line over the next 6 to 12 months? How much cash can we distribute to shareholders? Whatever it is, you need to have a couple quick questions that are for yourself so that when you get to the end, you've got the answers. Then 2 numbers is the limit for every single assumption. So remember, we're creating a forward-looking set of financial statements, income statement, balance sheet, cash flow. But the rule is there's only 2 numbers that can be used to drive each assumption. I'm going to talk about why that's so important and give you a couple examples. And then the forecasting process, as I'm teaching it right here, it only requires 1 person. So we're not sending a list out to the 25 people in the sales department and asking them to tell us what they're going to close over the next 6 to 12 months or each month over the next 12 months. We're doing this as a 1-person exercise. Okay, so just many of those things are kind of counter to it. Keep them in the back of your mind as we go through these 10 rules. So I've listed them here. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on these, but I wanted to list them in one place so that you have it. And then the download that you can grab goes into these in much more detail. But I'm going to hit on these just real quick, and then I've got some slides where we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about some of these. Okay, so the first thing is that remember it's all about decision making. This is not about precision. It's a top-down exercise, not bottom-up. So it's the 100% exact opposite of how financial statements are put together. So for the accountants out there like me, this is one where you just have to kind of spin your head around, do a 180, because you're going to be thinking about these numbers in a totally different perspective. It's top-down driver-based. We're creating a rolling forecast kind of concept here, and it's driven by those key drivers, not the way financial statements are, which is very, very, very bottom-up transaction, roll it up to the GL and then roll it into financial statements kind of process. And we're modeling a full set of financial statements that we talked about. Rule number 4 says first look back, then look forward. What I mean by that is most people have a tendency and make the mistake that I'm going to create a forecast, so they start with a blank slate. Start with a blank spreadsheet or get a software forecasting tool and they're starting from scratch. But that is a serious mistake. The very first thing you do is you bring the historicals together in the same format that you're going to forecast. That's the very first step, because we've got to first look at what are the key drivers that we're going to use to drive the forecast results. Rule number 5 is that you got to understand the high-level company strategy and expectations. Now, for the most part, depending on your position, hopefully you are very much in touch with kind of the high-level company strategy and expectations. But it's important, if not, to begin having those discussions about what's the company driving toward, what are the bigger picture objectives, because you're starting at the top, and you want to also understand what those expectations are. So when you have a forecast result that is going to be out of sorts or create a disconnect with what senior leadership is expecting, then you know that you're going to put a little extra work in making sure that you're confident and that what you're creating is reliable, but that you have some basis for understanding what those expectations are in the first place. And then in rule number 6, we've got to always be thinking about how to simplify, because the devil's going to jump on your shoulder when you're in this process, and it's going to say, hey, I got to go get some more detail. I got to go ask some more people what their assumptions are, because I don't know what I should have in here. So you got to always be thinking about, make this simple. And then we're going to do it using a repeatable process. So that repeatable process is important because we're not just creating a one-off forecast. This is something that we're going to update every month, every quarter, depending on what your financial rhythm is. And so it's in here that you're also going to be making some decisions about, are you going to get started with a spreadsheet, or are you going to use forecasting software? Either one is fine. I tend to use forecasting software just because I'm not a super power user, but it all depends on how quickly you want to get started and what your goal is in the whole process. But it's got to be repeatable, because this is not a one-off kind of thing. And then in rule number 8, we're going to always think about being conservative, because generally in our results of the forecast, we're going to express, let's just say we're expressing profitability. We're going to usually do that in terms of a range. We expect profitability to be 6.5 to 7.2 million for the year or for the next 6 months. So we're going to make sure that we err on the side of being conservative. That's the side to err on. And then we're going to always condense the results to the 2-minute summary. And one of the reasons I like that, and the reason I have that rule in there and believe it's so important, is that we've got to make sure that when we've done our work, that we know that our goal is to glean the insights from that. That's what we want to communicate. We don't want to just plop this on somebody. And then if you don't have a process up and running right now, or if you're going to change your process, then just make sure you start for your eyes only. There's no need to create a forecasting process, put it out for someone before you're really comfortable with it. Make sure that you're just something you're doing for yourself for a little while before you start sharing it with a lot of other people. So what I like to do here, this is just a reminder on rule number 1, that this is not about precision in any way, because precision is the enemy. Precision is the one that's going to make you want to go out and roll up. You got 100 stores out there, it's going to make you want to go out and create a forecast for each of the 100 stores and then roll it up. What you really want to do when you're doing this kind of forecasting, driver-based rolling forecasting, is that we're going to pay a whole lot of attention to the trend. And we're going to mix that trend with our own knowledge and intuition about the business in order to create that forward-looking view of what we believe results are going to look like. All right, and then from time to time, you got to just have one of your colleagues, give a megaphone to one of your colleagues, have them remind you that this is top down, not bottom up. Top down, not bottom up, because you're going to be tempted to go into a lot of detail. And so here's an example of what I mean by top down. So, and this is the test, that kind of 2-number test for each assumption that you're going to have in the forecast, is what 2 numbers can I multiply together to arrive at my forecast assumption? And so as an example, let's just say one of those assumptions you got to make in a forecast is in the income statement, and that has to do with revenue. So the question is, what 2 numbers can I multiply together to get my revenue assumption? And so, let's say in a retailer, it may be number of customers times average ticket. In a law firm or a CPA firm, it may be hours incurred overall times average billing rate. In a convenience store, one component of revenues may be gallons times average selling price, or a fuel wholesaler. So that's what I mean by kind of driver-based, big picture, only 2 numbers that we're using in order to drive our forecast assumptions. And then we're always starting by loading historical financial results, so that when we start to do our work on what are the 2 numbers that I can multiply together to get revenues, what are the 2 numbers I can multiply together to estimate receivables, what are the 2 numbers I can use to estimate CapEx or some other number, we want to make sure that we test each one of those drivers against the history. And usually, this is what you will find, is that most people think, Philip, that sounds great. It sounds like a quick start approach to forecasting, but it won't work. There's just too many details that make up, and too many variables that make that up. And then we look at the historicals, and we pick the 2 numbers, and we take a look at this. Is this really a big picture driver? And then we look at that metric for the most recent 12 to 24 months. Well, it turns out it's very steady, and it is actually a good predictor. So, because most people are not looking at those kind of metrics when they look at historicals, they have a tendency to look more granular when they're doing that. And so when I talked a little bit about a repeatable process, part of this is the tool that you use, but part of it too is that this fits in what I like to call the monthly financial rhythm. So for me in my career, especially as a CFO, this was really where I could add the most value within the organization, and that is I had to make sure that I was doing a good job orchestrating the monthly financial rhythm. And the way that rhythm works is that in every organization, we got some big picture financial goals. And at any given time, any given quarter or 6-month period, there's always 1 to 3 very important specific financial targets that we're trying to hit. And it moves from time to time. In one case, it may be revenue target. In one case, it could, or in one quarter, it might be focused on gross margin. In another quarter, it may be taking DSO, or day sales outstanding, that's driving the speed of how we're collecting receivables. It may be that we're honed in on driving DSO from 36 down to 32. Whatever it is, we need to facilitate bringing that out and making it part of what we report against and compare against and create insights against. Then in the monitor phase, kind of the target, monitor, adjust phase. In the monitor phase, that's where we're looking at historical results to say what happened. Did we hit the target? Did we hit a rock? Or neither? And what are the trends? And then the forecast comes in to say, okay, all right, I know what happened. Now I want to know what's about to happen. Are we on course to hit the target, or are we on course to hit a rock? Or is there a big opportunity out there and we're on course to really blow away the plan, in which case we may need to scrap certain parts of the plan so we can really double down and drive those results even higher. And then in that monitor phase, as finance professionals, we're turning that information into insight to the field. And when we're communicating that to the field, it's about management reviewing the results, taking a look at the insight that we're providing, and then using that to say, what do I need to change in the field to get the results that we're after? Because they're out there, they know what the plans are, management in the field is making things happen. What they need to know is that we're getting their desired result. Because when they don't get the desired result, that's when they know they've got to get together and say, what do we need to do in order to create the results that we're after? And it's that rhythm that we can really provide a ton of value, and a reliable financial forecast is a very important component of that. And then this rhythm continues monthly. In most of the businesses I work in, it's a monthly process. For some, especially if it's a really large organization, maybe this rhythm is more of a quarterly kind of rhythm. But every single month, that forecast is it's being tweaked, not up by a whole lot. I'm not spending much time at all updating the forecast unless something really big is happening. And maybe depending on where you are, I'm adding some periods out to the end because it's always rolling. It's always being updated and rolled forward. But that process repeats, and it's an important part of how we need to make sure that we're always revising not only what has happened financially, but making it clear to everyone, here's what's about to happen financially speaking. All right, Ernie, here's our next polling question.
All right, thank you very much, sir. As you can see, I've gone ahead and launched our next polling question. Almost a little check to see how good Philip is doing at convincing you the value of financial forecasting, asking you, do you believe financial forecasting adds value in your organization? Again, we appreciate everyone's consideration in answering all of our polling questions. Those of you interested in CTP or FP&A credits, you'll need to answer all of our polling questions and stay on till the end of the webinar. And also want to remind you that we can still take your questions in the questions area of your GoToWebinar control panel. I think it's already very evident of the great expertise and knowledge that Philip has and his great experience as a CFO at companies of various sizes. So I'm going to go ahead and leave the polling question up for a few seconds. Then I'm going to give my own little color commentary there. Then I'm going to let Philip get back to his great content. He's going to talk about the recipe for financial forecasting. So I'm going to go ahead and close the polling question and just share with you, Philip, before you continue, that we now have 90% of the audience convinced that this is extremely valuable. So we have 10% to go. So take us home, Philip.
All right. And for the 90% too, it's one thing to know that we can create some value there, right? Well, we got to be able to do it, and we got to do it away because we have our real job. I like to call our day jobs, right? There's a whole lot of work that we have to do, and actually forecasting in many ways is just adding to that. So we also got to make sure that we got a good, simple, repeatable process to make that happen. All right, so here's what the recipe, and this is also in one of the PDF downloads that you have so that you can go through this in more detail. And I'm going to just hit a couple of these subjects, but I wanted to kind of put them up here in front of you because the thing is, what I want you to do, though, is when you're sitting down to actually work on the forecast, you're at the computer, you got to think in terms of, I got to do some planning here before I start creating the forecast. Once I get that plan set, then I'm ready to begin thinking through the process of actually the creation and the creation of the assumptions and things like that. And then when I've got that done and there's my forecast sitting there, I've also got to think, I got to switch gears, put a different hat on. How am I going to present this so as to glean the insights from it and make sure that it's actually providing value? So in that process, when you go into the planning process, it's important to set some objectives. Like in one case, in one company where we're doing some financial forecasting. We set basically two very simple objectives, but we wrote them down because when the process was over, we were going to loop back and make sure we achieved them. And they were real simple: implement a reliable financial forecasting process and ensure the forecast could be easily updated, because we had some new people coming on the board, some more experienced people. The company was about to double revenues, and we wanted to make sure that we had a mature, professional approach to being able to show them as they came on the board what the real drivers of success were, where we're trying to take this company, and make sure that they always had the information every month and every quarter to be able to see not only what happened, but what's about to happen. We got to pick the historical and future periods, and what I would encourage you to do is for the future periods, pick a short window to start with, maybe 6 months at the most to start. There's no need trying to go out, a couple years. And I generally don't go out more than about 18 months anyway. And then we're going to identify the key drivers. That's always financial and non-financial. That sometimes is a surprise for people, that you're not going to just be gathering information from the general ledger here. We're going to also be gathering non-financial information, because when you go that two numbers approach to every assumption, what two numbers can I multiply together to get my amount, my forecast amount, it's almost always includes a non-financial metric. Something that's not just sitting in the GL waiting for you to roll it up. Okay, so then in the create phase, this is where most all the work is. We're going to gather the financial data. We're going to make sure we have a good idea of where the company is going. And then that create forecast there, just 3 words, create the forecast. That's where a lot of the work is. And I'll give you I'll show you what some of those variables are that we're going to put in there. So we talked about the 2-minute summary. That's one of the most important things that you can do to get value from the forecast, so that you're not just plopping another set of numbers on leadership. And then when we are presenting forecast results, that we generally, I like to always do that in the context of, let's just say they're months. I got the months of history leading up to where there's historicals, and then the forecast results. So I generally never present the forecast by themselves. They're always next to historicals and then forecast, so that it's easy to see the trend. It's easy to see if there's anything weird or unusual in there. And that's also a good tip for you when you're reviewing things, to make sure that you're putting them side by side. And then we're going to make that part of the financial rhythm, like I mentioned before. So here, and I go into a lot more detail in each one of these in that download that you can grab. But for revenues, the two numbers, in this particular case, I use customers or transaction time average revenue. Kind of depends what you're doing. I did one of the examples in the book. We did an extensive example on a construction company. We had number of projects times average revenue per project. With gross profit, is gross margin times revenues, 2 numbers. With operating expenses, if I'm in a company and I have a good solid, let's just say I have a decent budget of what I can expect to happen on the expense side, I may just lay them in there. If it's a company that I'm doing something big picture-wise, that I'm not as intimate with what's going on there, I'll use the 2 numbers approach to maybe a couple different sections in operating expenses. Cash, because we're doing a balance sheet and cash flow, cash really, there's no assumptions there, it's just the end result. And what we find out with cash is whether we're making any wild or crazy assumptions in the rest of our work here. But inventory, as an example, days inventory outstanding times cost of goods sold, or in property and equipment, it could be the 2 number approach. Or if you just say, if there's a CapEx plan, it says we're going to spend $2.2 million, then I would probably just go with the CapEx plan. Accounts payable, I almost always use days payable outstanding times cost of goods sold. With debt, sometimes I'll lay in, if I got a debt schedule, I'll just lay that in there because it's nice and easy. It kind of just depends, really. If you got a bank line, you got to make some assumptions there, because the bank line and the cash line can kind of be tied together. And then in the owner equity related accounts, usually if there's some kind of money coming in, or we're selling some stock, or if there's some owner distribution plans, then I make sure I build some assumptions in there. And oftentimes that's what, depending on the organization and the type of legal entity, that's oftentimes where you're going to spend a good bit of time, because that's what the people on high are interested in. How much cash can I distribute? Okay, so then I'm going to kind of wrap some of this up by just going right back to that 3-2-1 quick start approach that we just talked about, where we're starting with 3 questions. We've got 2 numbers as the limit for each assumption and only 1 person doing the forecast. The way you make that work, and this is really important, this is worth writing down. You want to disconnect everything else that you have from the forecast, because what you're going to be tempted to say. In one case, I was talking to a CFO, and he had a business that was growing rapidly, where he could have a big order come in that was maybe 40% of annual revenues, because they were growing dramatically and rapidly. And so he had to do some forecasts just to say, okay, what's the impact on cash going to be? How much money am I going to have to borrow? Because he's got to go out and buy the product where he can sell it. He's got people that he's going to have to go out and do install it. So then his thought was, okay, well, I've got to do this anyway as I look at some of the impact of just bringing on a really big customer. I just need to roll that up into a forecast. Wrong. That will never work. You'll never get to a point where you have a reliable financial forecast if you're trying to roll it up from that kind of detail. So the very first thing you do is just disconnect from every other process. And then the next tip to shorten your work basically is to dramatically shorten the forecast period. So if you're going out 2 or 3 years, then it's really not a financial forecast. That's probably more of a projection or what someone's looking for in the future. And if you're just getting started with something, what I would do is pull that back. And I do this when I'm doing some consulting work. I'm going to put in help put in a financial forecasting process for a company. We spend most of our time with the historicals, and we're only looking initially to go out about 3 months, because we've got to put something in place. We've got to identify the drivers. We've got to make assumptions. And then we're going to spend a few months just finding out that if I do a forecast for June, July, August, then as soon as June gets here, I get to see how did I do, and how am I looking. And then the next month, how did I do, how am I looking. So I get to tighten up the process and make sure that it's good by shortening that forecast period. Especially if you're going to put this in front of somebody, you don't want to go too far out, because then you're just setting yourself up for failure. And then you got to remember, every single forecast ever created is wrong. The question is, the real test is it reliable? In fact, you have to just you have to get comfortable with the fact that you're going to create something that's wrong. That's why you want to express results oftentimes when you're gleaning the insights in terms of a range, not a specific number, a specific point in time. Okay, and so I mentioned this kind of big fear that we all have. So this is a boardroom in there. They're not looking too happy. That's a CEO on the left saying, remember, I'm behind you all the way. And this is the CFO walking in with this forecast, because it's got forecasts that maybe are going to paint a picture different maybe than the CEO would like to see, or maybe different than the board would like to see. So when you get, if you are successful kind of creating a process, getting people to buy into it, you're creating a tool where you don't have to have some of those difficult conversations. And then, well, for me, I've been in a lot of those, because nobody wants to hear that the future maybe isn't as bright as what they like to think it was. So it takes a little bit of financial maturity that we all learn to acquire early in our careers. But one of the real big kind of counterintuitive benefits of a forecast is that it does give you permission to put something in front of people. And it doesn't matter, they're less interested in is it good or bad. They just want to know, what do we need to be doing as a result? So that's a very important part of the overall process there. Okay, so a few additional resources before we get to Q&A. So the 10 rules are in the download you can grab there. It goes into a good bit more detail. The recipe for financial forecasting there as well. So we'll go into each of those assumptions, around how we estimating receivables, inventory, all the different things that are going to drive to the real ultimate bottom line in a forecast, which is what's going on with the cash. And then financialrhythm.com is a website I have. Got a lot of cool stuff there, all a bunch of free stuff, and then you've got these other thought leadership resources. Ernie, you want to hit some questions?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for your fantastic and compelling content. It was awesome for me to put my practitioner hat on today. So I have my own questions, which are going to be helpful, hopefully everyone else, in addition to the questions that we have from our audience. A few questions, Philip, we had around drivers. Can you give us your insights as to how do I guess three things. How to identify the drivers, and then in your career, how have you noticed that the drivers are different across the size companies and industries that you've been involved with?
Well, you're right. They're all different because it's really driven a lot by the business model itself. So a construction company is going to be a whole lot different than a CPA firm, as an example. So I think the way you identify the drivers is first is thinking big picture about what influences financial results, what influences profitability, what influences cash flow. So then when I drop in, that's why I say the very first thing we're always going to do is we're dropping in historical financial results. So, I have a model and I drop in the historical results, and then I start thinking big picture. Because one way here's an example. Let's just say that, I'm looking at the history and I'm looking at history by month. So if I look at March and I look at April and I've got other months there later, sometimes I'll go say 12 to 18 months. Then the very first place I'm going to start is revenue. What are the two numbers I can multiply together to get revenues? And force yourself to get to the two numbers, not to the 15 or 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 that you could come up with. It's just big picture. What are the two numbers I can multiply together to get revenues? And you're going to get them, and then you just test them against the historicals. Now, what it forces you to do then is take a look at what some of the non-financial data that you need. And then what that does is it really gets you thinking about what's the business model. Like the fuel wholesaler, they're selling fuel and they're charging a price for it. Well, when I look at the two numbers and I say, well, what the two numbers are gallons times average price. And I say, if that's true, let me see what the gallons are for these same periods. And then let me just compute the average, right? So then I just throw that formula back, or I have that set up in my forecasting tool. So I just basically test what are the drivers by just thinking big picture and then testing it against the historical financial results.
Okay, great. Next question, have a few questions, and I'm going to confess I am one of these people that has been a bottom-up person. So you mentioned how you disconnect everything from the forecast. From the example that you have given, how do you get someone to do that? So you mentioned he's 40% growth, he's wanting to go bottom up. How do you address that with someone?
Well, we use the two number rule for creating our forecast at top, right? And then here's the escape hatch, basically. When someone says I can't do it. So we start looking at the historicals. We start to show, maybe there are some relationships up here at the driver level. But then I provide them an escape hatch. Hey, we can drill down on any one of these things and go as deep as you want to go, right? So if like in one case, we were doing a forecast and we were looking at revenue, and it was kind of a number of customers times average ticket. But the trend was going the wrong direction, right? Trend was going down in revenues. So then the question was, dang, what's causing that? And so we kind of pulled the reserve parachute and said, okay, let's go ahead. In this case, we're going to go outside of our forecasting process. Let's take a look at what's driving the number down. We said, what two numbers can we look at to kind of go one level deep? In this particular case, instead of just customers, it was new customers plus old customers equal total customers. And what we did when we started looking at that, we saw that the trend was that we had plenty of new customers. It was just repeat customers were going down, and that's what was driving overall customers down, which was what was driving revenues down. So I think, so kind of loop back on that is that you can't, I kind of create permission to kind of go off in a separate process if somebody wants to drill down, but we unhook it because what I don't want them to do is to begin trying to make granular level assumptions and roll it up, because there's a fact. It's kind of like there's gravity, right? One reason you can't just jump off a building and fly is because of the law of gravity. So the law here is that the more detail you bring in to a forecasting process, the more error you create. And our goal is to create a reliable financial forecast, because if we create an unreliable financial forecast, we will harm our own personal influence and credibility within the organization. We might even actually harm the organization if they think it's reliable and they start making decisions based on something that's not reliable. So that, for example, if you've got 100 stores out there, you don't go make your estimates about what our sales is going to be at the 100 stores and roll it up. that actually creates error. You do it at the highest level because you actually create a more reliable, usable forecast number.
Okay, great, fantastic. Final couple questions for you. One would be, how has your process changed over your career? More specifically, how has it changed over the past few years with the influx of technology and information, or has it changed at all?
Beautiful. Oh, it hasn't really changed much, except I'm just a bigger and bigger believer in it, and I never do any consulting work or work within an organization without it. And that's true, but true. I learned that by the first couple of years of my career. But what has changed is that, as an example, I had a forecast, and this was in an operation that sold fresh food and things like that. Big organization, lots of stores, and there was a couple components of the gross profit forecast that could bounce around. Right? So I could use margin, but I knew there was some bouncing around, and there was a couple very specific categories that was creating that bounce. And so it was starting to drive me crazy, because what I want to have, before the month is over, I have an expectation of what the income statement is going to look like. I have an expectation of what the balance sheet is going to look like, and I have an expectation of what cash flow is going to look like. But I had this one variable that kept bouncing around. And so what I did, and it was in a big database, lots, million row kind of database. I'm not a spreadsheet guru. So what I did is I found within the last 12 months a BI tool that really worked well for me. And I was able to hook up to a large multi-million record data set. And then I created basically a dashboard that gleaned from it. But it was basically throwouts of food. Could go and mark up and mark down kind of information in a retail environment. That number would sometimes be a surprise for me, and it was getting to the point where my forecast was not quite unreliable, but it wasn't up to my standard. So I hooked that database up, multi-million record kind of data files, got a dashboard where now every single day I see what those throwouts were and what that information was. So now I get to see, as each day goes by, I kind of see, first I have a better sense of what drives those throwouts, and I know what's coming down the pike much better. So what it did, it helped me make a better projection about a large mover within cost of goods sold. So that's probably been the single biggest change for me. I don't try to roll my forecast up from there, but I use some BI tools now to get daily or weekly dashboards of information that used to have to wait, till the closing process to get my hands on.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. With that, in order to be mindful of our time, I'm going to go ahead and launch our final polling question as I make my final comments. Just an interesting question in my mind, that if you had one wish to improve the FP&A function at your company, of which forecasting is obviously a part, more executive support, more accountability, the right data, the right systems, the right people, maybe all of the above. So first of all, I would once again like to thank Philip for his great insights and compelling contents. Thank you very much, Philip. I sincerely appreciate that.
You're welcome. Love being part of the webinar.
Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and give you guys a little warning. I'm going to go ahead and close that final polling question here in a couple seconds. Thank you very much, everyone, for answering all of our polling questions. And I'd like to thank our webinar partner, Centage. We appreciate their commitment to thought leadership, which is also evident in the great resources they offer, which you can review by visiting the Centage website. And finally, to you, our audience, thank you so much for your valuable time today. Please let us know what we can do better and make the rest of your day great.